Okay, so in this module, we're going to be looking at the idea of performance. And in fact, it's going to be a theme across our 3 modules this week, although we're going to look at it in some different contexts. Now, as I said last week, the actual lecture component for this will be quite short, but you will find that there's quite a lot of links. And if we were doing this face-to-face in a classroom, we'd actually be watching quite a bit of the footage and then teasing it out in our discussions. So what could be really useful for you to do is to watch different parts of footage. You don't necessarily need to go to every link, but perhaps going to some of them. And then, as part of your reflection, you could think about, the kind of things that you find interesting that you might have raised in a face-to-face context. So when we think about performance in the contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander context, one of the biggest gatherings, that celebrates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander performance is the Garma Festival. And they have quite a comprehensive website, which we've given you the link to. And it generally runs around the first week of August, has different themes. But while it has, visual arts and storytelling and dance, it also plays a role in creating leadership and in bringing and highlighting different political messages, because it is attended, quite often by politicians and those kinds of people. At the same time, in August, we generally also celebrate the National Indigenous Music Awards. Okay, these are currently, being tallied for this year. And so it's been going for 15 years. Today is this year is its 16th iteration. So it's got quite good longevity. Okay. Another really famous festival is the Barunga Festival. And that runs, in June generally, so it's just past, and generally attracts, several thousand people, and, has a sort of a camping element to it as well. So, similar to some other Indigenous festivals globally. Okay. And then the last of the festivals that I want to talk about is the Laura Dance Festival, which happens in Cape York. And again, this is generally around the period of June. So there's quite a vibrant festivals and awards scene for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander performance. It is concentrated on the Northern Territory, but we can certainly see that elements like dance are experienced right across the country. Okay, so, I suppose in some ways there's a little bit of an argument about, what is traditional, what is contemporary. I think for our purposes, we're looking at any kind of performance, both by Aboriginal people, but also embodying a particular cultural perspective. So in that way, we can see, groups like the Bangarra Dance Theatre in Sydney, which take from different global dance traditions, as well as incorporating and extending Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander dance traditions. Okay, so some great links here for you to have a little bit of a look at. So we know that, globally, dance is used to tell stories. What we sometimes don't think about is the way that dance can be used to express and assert rights, okay, to show different Indigenous identities, to look at power and politics, to be considered in a cross-cultural setting and to be repositioned. So how to take ancestral dances and make them relevant for contemporary audiences, and also sometimes to remove elements that might be seen as secret or sacred. Okay, so there are so many different elements to consider when we look at our analysis of dance. So here's one example. After the Wick decision in 1996, a senior Wick woman broke into a spontaneous dance outside of the High Court in Canberra. Okay, so the question is then, was this dance for Indigenous rights, for identity, for political purposes, or for entertainment? Yeah, and I think these are questions that are sometimes difficult to answer, because in part what we're talking about is this notion of cultural storytelling. So we've got art, which is the visual form, customs, the practical form, dance, the physical form, music, the acoustic form, totems, which are spiritual forms, law, the cultural form, and lands, the geographic form. All of these together form a dreaming. Okay, so, if you've done other courses with us, you'll know that, we regard the dreaming as being that blueprint for all life, laying down the way in which we enter into relationships with other humans, with the land, with animals, and with the metaphysical world. Okay, so, there's an example of, what is sometimes referred to as decolonizing music, and Sovereign Tracks is one of those. So it allows for young Indigenous artists who want to develop their music. So I think some really interesting thoughts that are coming out of, these kind of platforms. Now, we can also see that many Indigenous artists express themselves through poetry. Okay, so we talked briefly in one of our previous modules about, poets like Udru Nanako, and a contemporary poet is Romaine Morton. And, she says, that her work is a direct response to the environment that she grew up in. So this contemporary experience, this environment that people are growing up in, really has stood in contrast to some of the ways that Indigenous people's experiences have tried to be categorised since colonisation. Okay, but we do know that there are linkages between the traditional and the contemporary, and that Indigenous performance is not merely for entertainment. It operates through highly contested arenas of social and kin networks that demonstrate and consolidate kin and group boundaries. Okay? So it's really important, I think, for us to see the political and social and cultural messages that are coming out of these performances. Now, we know that traditionally that the right to sing songs about country, the right to lead rituals and dance, is not something which one gets automatically, but which comes as part of, a lived experience, a connection to country, and, continues, I think, to be really strong, for many people. Okay, so we know that it's not simply about rights, but it's also really significantly, I think, about responsibilities. Okay, so some of this, could be, as we see in the link here, a story about creation, or it could be a contemporary story. singing to the land. We know that every year, January 26th, which is celebrated by some Australians as Australia Day, is incredibly controversial. And so, we see again and again different elements of performances which try to tease out some of the tensions that are related in that day. Okay, so we can also see that, some Indigenous artists are taking works from the past and doing remixes, much as, we see in contemporary music globally. So we've got one example here, which is Solid Rock, and this was shot in Gunnedah, which is in Western New South Wales. And, the original artist gave permission for the remix. And I think, that sometimes, taking these different kind of iconic songs or iconic titles like I Still Call Australia Home really demonstrate the way in which some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists are being creative and playful with some things that, might be seen as being, almost sacred in the Australian music scene. But certainly one of the songs which, was really groundbreaking was Yothu Yindi's song Treaty. Okay, and Yothu Yindi means mother and child, and Treaty was composed in collaboration with Paul Kelly and Midnight Oil. And, it was the first pop song ever to be sung in the Yolngu language. But even now we're seeing new Yolngu artists like Baker Boy coming to prominence. Okay, Treaty, of course, had a very overtly political message, and it's important, I think, not to get lost, let that message get lost as we're listening to the lyrics, although it is just, a great song to listen to. We can also see that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander performance has been developed through things like black theatre, which started in the 1960s, in street theatre as a kind of protest. And, it raised awareness about racism, dispossession, and rights violations. And it's continued to do so. Okay, so, there are quite a few cultural performance companies. So we've already briefly touched on Bangarra, but others like the Stalker Theatre, and, in our own region, the Nasda Dance College at the Central Coast. And, then we've got a list here of some recent works that have been produced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists. Okay. All right, so the National Black Theatre, is seen to have made, a really significant contribution to our understanding of, I think, the nature of performance and the way that it was raised. So that it was really one of the first times that predominantly white audiences, got to see black actors presenting themselves. But this is far more common now. So it's interesting that we see shows like black comedy, different segments like the Housewives of Narromine, Aboriginal comedians like Sean Chulbara. Okay, and, while a lot of these, aren't making it to, the paid TV, they are popular on areas like the ABC and SBS. We can also see some examples of black opera. Okay, so Pecan Summer is one example from the last couple of years, which takes a particular art form and, indigenizes it, if you like, to use the more contemporary kind of terminology. Okay, and we can see that stories about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have really figured quite prominently in recordings and other audiovisual media. And so the National Film and Sound Archives is a really great resource that we can use to look at performance. Okay. So then what we've got here, these are predominantly sort of historical songs now, I suppose, more than 30 years, or around 20 to 30 years old. But they really give you an insight into how songs, have impacted on, the public life. So, then taking this to a more recent, song, Dumb Things by Paul Kelly, Dan Sultan, and AB Original. Okay, so what we'd really encourage you to do is to click on some of these links and start engaging with the material, because it's quite dry unless you're actually looking at some of what we're talking about.